Wonderful. All right, here we go. This is our 40th symposium, which is really amazing. But I want to make it that. So this is our 40th symposium. And we started the symposium series as part of the goals of the center. The center has both the educational and a networking kind of goal. We want to bring together interdisciplinary groups of scholars to discuss things and find out new things. And so we've always had set up our symposia so they go from like micro to macro. We try to get people to again the molecular level, within the individual host level, on the population level, the environmental level, very broad. And I love it because I get to learn all kinds of new things and meet many wonderful people. That you all know who's going to be here, but just to remind you, because we have an educational mission, we also have each speaker introduced by a student. You'll notice by that, like that. And then prior to the each symposium, we have a journal club where we read the suggested papers by the students, by the speakers. And in case you haven't already discovered it, I think what I want to do is I want to get rid of this because this is showing. The lunch buffet and refreshments will be served in the ballroom across the hall. So one of our educational activities I want to highlight is recently initiated Climate and Health Fellows Program. This was funded by funds from the College of Engineering, the Research Dean Associate Funds at SEAS, the School of Public Health Research Development Support Fund, and the Provost Office. And it was really a great opportunity for us to do something new. The goals of the Climate and Health Fellows Program you see here, we really want to build a cross-campus interdisciplinary community of scholars working on the intersection of climate and health, and increase awareness of the breadth of U of M projects and research groups and community partners focused on climate change, climate adaptation, extreme precipitation events in health. And the number of people engaged in this area is phenomenal here at U of M. And then foster development of collaborations and provide professional development opportunity for early care faculty. There will be some, it's going to be a mix of fellows only and open to other people for different events during the year. There'll be one a month. So if you would like to be included, please let me know. We have 14 fellows this year from 7 different units on campus. So I'm very proud of that. And so including that you would think the sciences, but not just the sciences. We also have the humanities. We have some fellows from the School of Music and from the School of Art. And we hope we've applying for funding, and we hope we will have funding to continue this program for many years. And in case you're wondering how we decide on the topics, this is the very serious meeting we generally hold. And yeah, Kevin Rose was asking, how do we pick the speakers? I mean, after people come up with a topic, I said, suggest speakers. And then I ask around, and then I also peruse literature quite a bit to try to see if there's some people there whose voices are up and coming voices that you're not as loud as the other ones. But we also take advantage of high profile people as they become available. And since our goal really of this is to foster discussion and networking, I'd like to invite everybody here to introduce themselves to someone they don't yet know right now. So just turn around. If there's someone you don't know, the video will be next. So, okay. So do I need to do something? April. All right. Yeah. Please keep it up, but not during the talks. You'll notice that the schedule, there is lots of time to networking, and I hope now, when we have a break, you at least have someone you can start a conversation. Okay. So this is one thing I wanted to do is I was very taken with the last words of Jane Goodall, and I don't know if other people have had a chance to hear them.
And the health of the planet.
Yes.
And our children and grandchildren, that dreams of the future.
Okay, she's doing a toast. I can't get the video on here, sorry.
I grin.
What a delight. So thank you. I leave you to it. Thank you, Jane.
So she just, there's an hour interview you can see on Netflix, but then there's, she just gives her last words.
In the place where I am now, I look back over my life. I look back at the world I've left behind. What message do I want to leave? I want to make sure that you all understand that each and every one of you has a role to play. You may not know it, you may not find it, but your life matters, and you are here for a reason. And I just hope that that reason will become apparent as you live through your life. I want you to know that whether or not you find that role that you're supposed to play, your life does matter, and that every single day you live, you make a difference in the world. And you get to choose the difference that you make. I want you to understand that we are part of the natural world. And even today, where the planet is dark, there still is hope. Don't lose hope. If you lose hope, you become apathetic and do nothing. And if you want to save what is still beautiful in this world, if you want to save the planet for the future generations, your grandchildren, their grandchildren, then think about the actions you take each day, because multiplied 1,000,000, 1,000,000,000 times, even small actions will make for great change. I just hope that you understand that this life on planet Earth isn't the end. I believe, and now I know, that there is life beyond death, that consciousness survives. I can't tell you from where I am secrets that are not mine to share. I can't tell you what you will find when you leave planet Earth. But I want you to know that your life on planet Earth will make some difference in the kind of life that you find after you die. Above all, I want you to think about the fact that we are part, when we're on planet Earth, we are part of Mother Nature. We depend on Mother Nature for clean air, for water, for food, for clothing, for everything. And as we destroy one ecosystem after another, as we create worse climate change, worse loss of diversity, we have to do everything in our power to make the world a better place for the children alive today and for those that will follow. You have it in your power to make a difference. Don't give up. There is a future for you. Do your best while you're still on this beautiful planet Earth that I look down upon from where I am now. God bless you all.
So with that, I just thought we should all think about that more today in the future, but also I have thank yous here. There are many people, you don't put this on by yourself, obviously. I'm trying to go back and show all the volunteers. It's not working here, but I'll get it. I'll get it. Here we go. So you may have noticed that there are students running around making things happen, people doing all kinds of good stuff, and it is very much appreciated. And so if you happen to see them or meet them, please thank them for that. And the person you also should thank is Anna Cronenwert, who, yes, who's, yeah. She makes this whole thing run, and it's not just today and yesterday. Okay, so there's a lot of work here, and without her, I don't know what I would do at this point in making them run. She's got it run like clockwork. This particular symposium was funded by money for the center and the Goodicus lectureship of the School of actually the Epidemiology department. And we are very proud that we have, this is free and open to all, the community, everywhere, not just the university community, and we buy you lunch. So there you go. So with that, please save the date. April 17th will be the next symposium. And I will exit Zoom.
Okay. So hello, everyone. It's wonderful to be here on this beautiful day. My name is Brad Popovich. I'm currently a dual degree master's student between the Ford School of Public Policy and the School for Environment and Sustainability. And it's an honor today to introduce one of today's speakers, Professor Jen Maigret. Jen Maigret is a professor of architecture and the director of Climate Futures at the Taubman School of Architecture and Urban Planning. She's also a licensed architect with over 2 decades of professional experience and a unique interdisciplinary background, holding master's degrees with both architecture and ecology-related subjects. Her work and research sit at the fascinating intersection of architecture, climate action, ecological health, exploring how design can serve as a tool for improving both environmental and human well-being. From the years 2018 to 2024, Professor Maigret served as principal at PLY Plus Architecture, Urbanism, Design, where she and her colleagues led several national and internationally recognized projects. In 2021, PLY Plus was honored with an Emerging Voices Award from the Architectural League of New York, one of the most prestigious recognitions in North America for design firms with the distinctive voice and impact body of realized work. And beyond her practice, she has played a major leadership role in advancing the University of Michigan sustainability goals. She's co-led the development of carbon neutral building standards for the President's Commission on Carbon Neutrality. And she's continued to serve on initiatives such as the Design Guidelines RFP Selection Committee and the Resilient Grounds Steering Committee. Her teaching and mentorship reflects her deep commitment to sustainability and interdisciplinary design. She leads both a required graduate course in sustainable architecture and an undergraduate elective open to students across campus, helping to inspire the next generation of designers to integrate climate action into the built environment. Altogether, her career exemplifies how architecture can bridge ecological science, cultural contexts, and design excellence, helping us imagine and build a more resilient and regenerative future. So please join me in welcoming Professor Jen Maigret.
Well, thank you for such a generous introduction. That did a lot of work. I do have a quick introduction to make, but before I do, I just want to thank everyone for joining us this morning, and especially to thank Dr. Betsy Foxman for taking a bit of a risk and bringing an architect into the room with a group of people who perhaps are not accustomed to hearing from architects in formats like this, which is really inspiring to be a part of. So I'm really happy to be here today. I am going to set the stage of some of the work that I have been involved with over the years, as well as emerging opportunities that some of my colleagues at Taubman College have been engaged with to open up multiple pathways for potential ongoing collaboration within this framework. And let me see. There we go. You've already heard a very thorough introduction to me, but a quick maybe glimpse at what that bio looked like in my own personal experience. In my biological experience, I started off in evolutionary avian studies. So I was studying the eastern kingbird, and at that moment in time was actually in reflection already thinking about the connections between the quality of the environment, in this case, environmental health, like how many insects were available for feeding for the birds, and fecundity, how successful they were at raising offspring. This led me eventually to join a group working on ecological restoration. So I was part of burn crews and invasive removal and things of that nature for several years. And about 3 years into it, I started being asked to participate in site plan reviews and was reviewing primarily for wetland ordinances. And that was a real turning point for me because much of the work that was being brought to me was too far along in the process to really be changed in any significant way. So that triggered interest in what was happening upstream, so to speak, in terms of design thinking. And that led me to Michigan, actually, for my first time through my education, including doing my Master's of Architecture. This is a drawing from my master's thesis project where I was already thinking about water cycles in relationship to public spaces and thresholds of buildings. There we go. Oh, I can see why this is tricky. There we go. In terms of PLI and my early work, when I joined University of Michigan in 2019, I first started working, and this is some of the work that I'm going to share today, with a colleague who's still continuing to do a lot of water urbanism work at a more international scale at this point, Maria Arquero de Alarcón. She and I joined together for the first 7 years of our time together at Michigan through a partnership called Made Studio, and I'll give you a little bit of a window into that work today. And as you heard from there, I joined and served as principal and co-owner of Ply Plus, a firm that's still practicing here in Ann Arbor. And I won't go too much into that work, but that work intersected my broader ambitions to improve the built environment in a number of other, or through a number of other lenses and beyond just water. As you also heard, I've recently had the privilege of stepping into a new leadership position at Taubman College called Climate Futures. It's a bit of an unusual platform and one that I'm really excited to be a part of because it's serving as something of an amplification platform. So very similar to the goals that were stated at the onset of this conversation around partnerships, networking, building community. I think of it as a climate collective. And we're about a year old, so we're just starting this work, but we started in-house, so to speak, and looking at and reflecting on all the work that was underway, trying to make that more visible, both so that the people doing the work can understand how it connects to other people working within similar or maybe parallel ways, and then making stronger connections to the curriculum and building stronger pathways for students to get involved. And so year one looked, or it used programming primarily to do this kind of work. We hosted a symposium. We had an open exhibit, and we'll be returning to those kinds of formats soon. We have a space, which some of you may have seen down on Liberty near the Argus Farm Stop, which is called the Liberty Annex. It's a space that we rent, have some faculty offices for making space there, and we have a small exhibit space. And that's where we hosted some of these events. It's under renovation right now, so you'll have to wait for a year until we open it up and welcome you all back. But broadly speaking, our work, I think, falls in themes of resilience, circularity, justice. And as you'll see in a moment, one of the skills and one of the distinctions, I think, of design disciplines is that we spend quite a lot of time helping imagine and visualize what kinds of alternate pathways are available to us. And so within the broader context of climate futures, we recently put a little publication online. It's linked to our institute in the Taubman College website. And here you can see a glimpse of the breadth of work that's underway in case you're looking for connectivity across these different themes. For the water theme that we're discussing today, Maria shows up again, but is now in partnership with a variety of other colleagues, still working on nature-based solutions in complex, large urban settings. So how do we enable different thinking about water management practices to improve the overall quality of the built environment. And oftentimes design is a lever through which we can model better practices that can then be adopted or translated through broader policies. So sometimes design is out in front of policy changes, and sometimes it works the other way around. And often when we're talking about this work, we're also talking about issues of climate justice, because it's not uncommon that the sites that need the most thinking and the most reimagination are those that historically have been thought of as sites of extraction or sites of production, and with that have come trade-offs and consequences for the communities living nearby. And so this is an example of some work underway, also in partnership with faculty at SEAS, thinking about these nature-based solutions also as a mechanism to reconcile and to try to move past some of the histories of environmental injustice that play out in communities like Dearborn. So the work I'm going to share with you today predates those two glimpses, but I think it sets the stage for the basic underlying interactions that are at play, and some of the roles that design thinking can play in helping to build bridges between analytical thinking and data and numbers and imagination. What do we do? How do we interpret those things? How do we move those forward? And I'm going to do this through the lens of the Great Lakes watershed basin. When Maria and I landed here, we both were new to the region and were fascinated by some of the things that we thought were quite unique and different from the places that we came from. My origins are on the east coast of the US. Maria is Spanish from Madrid, a very dry climate. And so we started by posing questions about intersections of water and urbanism throughout the Great Lakes. And it led to some early exhibit work like you see here, where we built a large model, which is essentially a continuous surface of topography and bathymetry, bringing water and underwater ground and above water ground together, which was surprisingly difficult. This was one of the early indications that disciplinary boundaries do have impact. It took an entire summer to find the different layers, which were carefully housed in different disciplines and did not necessarily match up or reconcile, and really took inspiration from the fact that sometimes simply bringing disparate information together through broader questions can open up opportunity. And we know what a wealth of water is in this region, and what a precious resource this is. So we approached the exploration of questions of water urbanism in large part through a lens that I think is really well described by the anthropologist Marilyn Strathern, where she reminds us that it matters what ideas we use to think other ideas with. So it matters how we approach the the problems that we see, sometimes suspending ideas about problems to be solved and looking for broader patterns and connections and seeing what other opportunities emerge from that. So in that spirit, we started analyzing and layering and drawing some of the things, some of the information that we had access to. And it probably doesn't come as a surprise that patterns like this became visible. What you're seeing here is the Great Lakes watershed basin, and all of the gray hatched zones that you see are areas where multiple municipalities have a common surface water stream running through them. So this is basically an indication of how much collaboration is required in order to protect water resources, because obviously if only one municipality out of the 3 or 4 or more who share a water body are enacting progressive policy, it will only go so far. So it really does require large-scale collaboration and common vision and common goals pretty much across the entire Great Lakes region. And the NRC also recognized this in stating back in 2001 that the course of action most likely to reverse degradation has more to do with changing the way that permits and boundaries are conceptualized than anything else already underway. This is what the region looks like if you only turn on the GIS layers for surface water. We know that we are an incredibly water-rich region, but in our imagination, I think we sometimes underestimate and realize, maybe don't experience in our everyday lives, the connectivity and the vast amount of water surfaces beyond the Great Lakes themselves and how interconnected this entire system is. And what I'll share in a moment is that this is not also disconnected from the way that patterns of urbanism have emerged in this region. Drawing is a tool for thinking for those of us who are designers. And so the way we thought our way through this wealth of early data was to produce what we came to call our unfolded shoreline. This is the US side of all of the edges of the Great Lakes region because we had more access to the US data than Canadian data. And without explaining all of this, some of the patterns that emerged, and the easiest one to explain in this format is the relationship between the very top band where you see the orange bars with black peaks within there. That's population. The orange is metro region. The black are city proper. We can see where Detroit is denoted. And then about the middle of the drawing, you see some very delicate blue lines, and below that, red text. That is a map of all of the surface water and where it comes in, surface streams or rivers comes into the Great Lakes. And below that are all the measures that the EPA oversees in terms of water indicators. There's 14 different water indicators, and every time you see red is where these surface waters are failing a number of those indicators. So there is a very strong correlation between where our waters are degraded, which I think is not a surprise to anyone in this room, and where we are more heavily urbanized. And I'm going to give a little more insight into one of the major drivers of that in the present moment. It's also worth remembering that the lakes have distinctive characteristics. Not all of them behave the same way. The volume and the characteristics of these lakes means that water circulates at different rates within and between the lakes. They are connected, and the water does eventually flow through the St. Lawrence Seaway and connect with the Atlantic. But those cycles of water change take quite a bit of different time, with the extremes being Lake Superior every 191 years and Lake Erie every 3 years. Lake Erie is the shallowest and the smallest of the lakes. It's also the most heavily urbanized, and has come to be known as a problematic site of algal blooms and so on. And that is closely related to the fact that it is both the smallest water body and the most urbanized. So I'm going to zoom in for a moment and just take a look at Detroit as one indicator, one model, and how we started to work from some of the challenges that exist toward a watershed imaginary, how we might design through something more like a watershed mindset. The primary challenge that the Great Lakes watershed faces from a water quality standpoint has to do with urban infrastructure. The EPA and the Clean Water Act have been relatively successful in bringing down point source pollution coming from factories and other kinds of places. But the great challenge that still remains has to do with non-point sources. And this has to do with infrastructure. So the image that you're seeing here, all those little green spots are examples of what are called outfalls or releases that happen with combined sewer overflows. This is a picture from one rainstorm. And I'm going to show a little in some of the wastewater treatment plants in the region. Many of you may already know this, but a quick introduction to what CSOs are, combined sewers and combined sewer overflows, through the diagrams on the upper right, and a little bit through the history of Detroit. So Detroit, by the late 1800s, early 1900s, was urbanizing incredibly quickly, already driven by industrial growth. And they were already facing a lot of public health crises and were in desperate need of an infrastructural solution, primarily to deal with wastewater. There were some drawings and some ideas already available that were being deployed in the UK at the time. So in many ways, combined sewers can be thought of as sort of an early shovel-ready project. It was readily available, it was inexpensive to build, and so they quickly started deploying this. And by 1922, what you can see with the little dashed lines is that some of those early sewer lines were already constructed. And at that moment in time, the premise was dilution is the solution. You get the waste out of the city into the river, and the river will magically clean it all up, or at least make it go away. Combined sewers mean that all the building plumbing connects with all of the surface water that goes into storm drains or that's coming off of roofs or road surfaces. And so everything ends up going into a single pipe, and those pipes eventually collect together and go to a wastewater treatment plant eventually. At this point, they were just going straight to the river. And as we'll see in a moment, there are two water crises that connect with public health concerns that stem from this system, which is still in place and very much in need of reimagination. One is that we have contemporary flooding, and we'll see in a moment how this connects to water quality issues, but as well as when these pipes get overfull, there's nowhere for water to go. So this is connected to why we see flooding often in Detroit on highways or in houses. And it actually is indirectly connected to the water crisis of water delivery to the citizens of Detroit, many of whom can no longer afford to purchase water delivered from DWSD, the water authority, or it's now the Great Lakes. It's under a different management now. Because the cost of the system, in large part tied to fines associated with violating the Clean Water Act, get associated and connected with the delivery of clean water as well. So these things are quite entangled. When we started this work, we often got the question, why in the world is Detroit's infrastructure failing when nobody lives there anymore? Isn't population movement and, isn't there a contradiction between the depopulation in Detroit and you telling me that the infrastructure is too full? And really, you have to understand the dynamics at play from a regional perspective, because the system that services Detroit also services a region much bigger. And it's also associated with population dynamics. So on the top images, what you see is the population change from 1950 to 2010, which does show that population in the city proper, which is outlined in black of Detroit, decreased, but population within the metro region increased. So essentially, all of those people have just more equally spread through the region, but also increased. And this black diagram on the bottom left is the region that the wastewater serves. So the region overall is about 8 times bigger than the city of Detroit proper. It's an enormous system. I believe it's still the largest in North America or in the US. The wastewater treatment plant in Detroit is also the largest in the US. But in spite of the scale of the system, it is not big enough and it continues to fail. And the way that it fails is through the design mechanisms that were established as part of CSOs. Because everything comes together and because conceptually there may be a need to redirect or to release pressure on the system, what are called outfalls were designed into the system, which are essentially release valves. And you find these along water bodies. So when it rains and when the pipes get too full, somebody has control to open up these release valves and release untreated sewage essentially into the rivers. And what you see in this diagram, all those little dots to the bottom of the image of Detroit is the Detroit River. To the left of that image is the Rouge River. And all those little dots are, most of them are points of discharge. There's a couple points that represent very small moments where there's disconnection between surface water and sewage water. And what that means when we were looking and getting a lot of the data, the data is publicly available. Again, it's a bit difficult to get, but when we were going through the process of going through the steps to getting the data between 2011 and 2015, the pattern that you see here was representative of how much untreated wastewater was being released into the combined rivers. So it was somewhere between 8.5 and 50 billion gallons in each of those years. And the image or the numbers to the right is a way to help imagine how much water that is. That is the number of times we would fill up the Wren Center with that amount of volume. So it's a lot of volume that we're talking about each given year. And it in large part explains why many of our surface waters are failing a number of health indicators when we measure water quality. So we took all of this information and then started to ask the question, how can design intervene? What can be done about this? And from our perspective, there was a kind of simple and obvious way to begin to approach questions about value within this challenge. We know that the wastewater system works when it's not raining. When we have dry days, the system is functioning and not releasing untreated sewage into the waterways. It's a problem when we have rainwater because of the ways that our cities are constructed, which is in large part with impervious surfaces. We have a lot of pavement, we have a lot of roadways, we have a lot of roofs that do not absorb water and shed it very quickly because historically we've been operating by building our cities and our buildings with an idea that water is something to be shed very quickly and that it is a waste and not a resource. But if we rethink water as a resource, in particular rainwater, and we start to think about our cities through topography rather than through sewer sheds, then a number of opportunities emerge. And so we tested these in speculative prototypical ways, first by looking at a neighborhood that at the time was kind of emblematic of many of the patterns of urbanism that we were seeing in Detroit. This is Brightmoor. Brightmoor is essentially a model neighborhood that is strongly associated with the legacy of industrialism in Detroit. It was a neighborhood that was designed, it's very small, single-family houses. Those houses were development constructed in the 1920s primarily. And the houses at the time were designed to be built so that one a day could be constructed, so that they could put these up very quickly and get workers in place. Over time, the neighborhood, like many neighborhoods in Detroit, has suffered from a number of structural issues that have led to vacancies. And so at the time, the neighborhood and continues to be reevaluating how to address vacancy to ensure the vibrancy of the community that continued to live there. And this kind of work is ongoing. At the time, one of the questions that we were asking had to do with work that some of our colleagues, including Margie Dewar, were doing at Taubman College and looking at patterns of vacancy and some of the complexity around conceptualizing what that is. It's common to think about, and even when I use the term vacancy, to imagine that means that there's nothing there. But in fact, vacant parcels and vacant properties do have long legal legacies. There are ownership histories, and oftentimes these are very complicated. And there are also ecological systems and other things that are still often intact, even if there isn't human occupancy actively happening on those parcels. So we were working a bit with Margie and also building from some of the research that she was publishing around the complexity of ownership to look for opportunities where there might be places where multiple parcels that were adjacent to one another could be reconceptualized through more of a common collective lens than maintaining the history of parcel boundaries that existed in this neighborhood. And in particular, one of the things we were trying to bring into conversation from an urban planning perspective is a rethinking of the kinds of layers that we look at and we use to make decisions about the future of development in cities. So something as simple as bringing a very classic layer called land use, which is what you see on the top left, that's color-coded to show what the intended use of all those boundary or all those properties are, where yellow is residential, red is commercial, blue is institutional, and purple is industrial. Here we see a very rigid, repetitive grid and an expectation for a pattern of use that should be redeveloped in this portion of the city. And bringing that together with LiDAR topography. So a bit of a reminder that, again, not all of that ground is necessarily as equal as those color codings lead us to believe. And a reminder that in a place like Brightmoor, there's also actually a history of historic streams that were buried around the same time that that sewer system was constructed, which you can very clearly see in the middle image. So on the very left of that middle image, the darkest color is the Rouge River, and not too far east from there is a low point where there is a historic stream bed. It turns out, even though we don't have statistical analysis of it, there was a correlation between where some of the most significant flooding from a residential perspective was happening in this neighborhood and those low areas, historically speaking. And when I talk about flooding in residential areas, one of the really problematic outcomes of the CSO system filling up is that in some places in Detroit, there has also been a repetitive pattern where that sewer backs all the way up into people's basements because it's overflowing in the wrong direction. And this is something that has historically happened quite commonly in Brightmoor, and there was a stronger association with those buildings that were in the lowlands as we were thinking of them. So this was just a way of suggesting if we start to bring the lens of water, both from the perspective of looking for opportunities to absorb more water and work with it within our urban patterns and maybe introduce a new land use layer that would be necessary, in addition to being careful not to repeat some of the patterns if we were trying to redensify and being careful about those low grounds. It gives us a different way of thinking about what urban patterns might be beyond the uniformity of grids being laid out. And so some of the work we did was visualizations like you see here, to be in conversation with community members and explaining why the basement flooding was happening, to help give leverage and voice to advocating for what changes could be made, and as well as bringing into the imagination of some of the planners and some of the others trying to reimagine the future of the city, what opportunities might come by thinking about multiple challenges at the same time and how overlaps could serve multiple interests, like thinking about water and vacancy and economic redevelopment all at the same time. As well, there's a layer of imagination that has to do then with how these things manifest in our built environment. And this is another area where I think a lot of additional work can be done, a lot of participation can happen. When Detroit faced some of the larger fines related to clean water violations and were trying to problem solve the infrastructure problem that they have in the, I'm forgetting the exact date, but 80s into the 90s, they were looking to solve, quote, the problem with a large-scale infrastructural intervention. And the proposal was to bury essentially a highway-scaled enclosure, a tube, underneath the Rouge River, which would be an enormous storage system where all that extra sewage would go and be held until it wasn't raining to be pumped back to the wastewater treatment plant. It was shut down by the EPA because of affordability problems, that it would have put all the rates so high that it would have priced everybody out of access. And at that point, Detroit started to pivot, the microphone's a little bit broken, to rain gardens and stormwater gardens and other things. And those early tests looked like the images you see on the bottom, which sparked a lot of tension because in communities that have experienced a lot of historic vacancy, you can understand why they might not be excited to have properties with plants that look an awful lot like the same plant communities that grow up on vacant parcels as the solution to water problems. So here the aesthetics matter a lot, and there was a lot of work that could also be done in terms of reimagining something as simple as planting palettes, or something as simple as layering in playful landscapes and thinking of these landscapes both in terms of water and community. The second example that we took a look at was the DeQuinder Cut. At this time, the DeQuinder Cut had not yet been redeveloped as we know it today. Historically, this was a train line, and it was cut down in order to allow flow of traffic to move more smoothly through the city. So the rail bed was depressed so that it wasn't disrupting traffic flow on the surface of the city. This work was done roughly 2010 to 2016. Around that time, the city started to imagine that abandoned rail lines, including the DeQuinder Cut, would be great opportunities to establish new greenways as part of their urban system. And because the conversation was just emerging, how does one take this old rail line and reimagine it as part of urban infrastructure from a social perspective? It also struck us as an amazing opportunity to think of it in terms of water as well. Is located essentially downtown. It touches the water and now is at the site of an education center that's also been, it was a vacant building at the time that's been redeveloped, associated with the DNR. And it moves essentially north to connect to Eastern Market and some other sites. And so we took a look at a zone around the Eastern, or sorry, not the Eastern, the DeQuinder Cut, including the Eastern Market, and did some analysis around the land use, around the level of impervious surface that was existing, vacancy patterns, et cetera. And we're asking questions around how can we use this opportunity of thinking about greenway redevelopment to also improve water quality and to improve the quality of public spaces, the public spaces that would be necessary to link connectivity, remembering that this is cut into the ground and therefore surface connections that allow people to get from the city down into the DeQuinder Cut are quite important. So we looked at 5 sites and used a grant that was really aimed at supporting the development of data to be made more available. So this in part was funded through the Graham Sustainability Institute and was associated with a group called Data Driven Detroit at the time. But we carved out a little bit of the money to help show what that might look like beyond the delivery of data in and of itself. And so we developed 5 speculative proposals, which essentially resolved the surface water, would absorb rainwater and use that rainwater to develop more public landscapes along with more architectural surfaces and elements that were more that had the cohesion of social interactions in mind. So a quick look at two of them. One of them we cited at Lafayette Park. This is a very famous residential district in Detroit that also has a very important architectural legacy with an architect by the name of Mies van der Rohe, who many of us who come up as architects study very closely. And in this particular site, we layered in some, as you see, the water landscapes, but much more generous ramping spaces to allow not just for movement, but also for slowness. So allowing different kinds of speeds to coexist as people move in and out of the space. And here we had a little nod to the legacy of Mies van der Rohe, part of which are a couple of towers as part of Lafayette Park, to design and propose a little water tower, something where you could walk up out of the Dequindre out of the city, and get high enough that you could see the Detroit River and begin to understand some of that connectivity and the promise of thinking about water quality to reconnecting with an urban resource like the river. And then in other sites like Eastern Market, those hardscapes had more to do with the extension of the market activities, including restaurants and other kinds of food-related uses. And here the water layers were more intense because not only were we thinking about volume of rainwater, but that rainwater has now interacted with a lot of polluted surfaces that function as part of the process of the markets and the deliveries and so on. And so here, keeping people away from the water as it first enters the system is quite important. And then slowly, as you move through the urban space, the Dequindre cut on your right, that water is also sequentially cleaned, and then more it's available or could be engaged with once it gets to the Dequindre cut. It's clean enough to engage with. And so a little bit didactic around what those landscape systems are doing and how they provide function and other kinds of benefits to urban spaces. And then lastly, I'll share a project that was a part of the practice at Ply Plus. This was a project that's still underway. It's been a bit of a slow burn, in part still because of COVID. This is a project that was originally going to start construction, and then COVID hit, and now it's been difficult to kind of regain some momentum, but I do believe that the full project will eventually come to fruition. And this is with Museum of Contemporary Art Detroit, so Midtown Detroit. This was part of a larger envisioning of redefining the arts district, which runs along Woodward in Detroit. MOCAD has been an important part of a number of places, sometimes called Sugar Hill, that have been re-envisioning in large part the spaces in between. How do we get some of the shared spaces and movement between these different amenities to be more urban, to be more open, to be more porous? And so the design project that we were asked to engage had both to do with site work as well as some museum redesign, which I won't get too much into. But the architectural components were quite small and surgical and had to do with really allowing the building to reconnect to these urban ambitions. So most of the changes had to do with relocating the entry to be connected to this new site work that was going to be underway called the Canopy, and making or reopening of a window to Woodward. This particular building has an important history. It was one of the first car showrooms on Woodward and was designed by another famous architect by the name of Albert Kahn. And so retaining a lot of the legacy and the kind of gradiness of the multiple layers of history was important, but also allowing this building to be reconnected, because since its original formation, there were a lot of renovations that were done that essentially blocked up all the windows and made it quite closed to the urban spaces around it. From a site perspective, The opportunity that was very exciting was that MOCAD recognized in conversation with us that if we were to take on more progressive sustainability goals within this project, it could also serve their programming ambitions in a couple of different ways. And so the parking lot, which is this makes it look clean, is a pretty beaten up gravel dirt parking lot, was the site for this reinvention. And this has to do also with a stormwater tax that Detroit relatively recently initiated within the city, which does tax property owners for the amount of impervious surface. So MOCAD, but there are some credits that you can gain if you start to handle water on site. So there was an opportunity to be thinking about the collection and the use of rainwater differently, which would reduce their tax burden and therefore free up those funds to be going towards arts programming, which is really how they would prefer to spend the money. And so we moved forward by working with them to essentially reimagine the parking lot into what we were calling a plaza, or thinking of it as a public space that could host cars, but was really intended to be about people and the connection of people in the city. MOCAD does a lot of summer programming, so we added a small stage. This was going to be a little timber with green roof exhibit, just to kind of visually demonstrate some of the technologies that are available to change the way we build the built environment. But a lot of the work was also happening in more hidden ways, so we were trying to pair those with visual moments. The parking lot is to be porous pavers. So this graphic overemphasizes a little bit. The actual pavers would have two different colors, but not quite as dramatic of a color change. But essentially those pavers signal the parking spaces. So the zigzags that you see are the width of a parking space. But more importantly, they bring the water down into a large cistern system that is underneath the parking lot and connected with the water coming off the roof and some of the perimeter of the site. And in the end, it's this combination of signaling things like new planted rain gardens along what you're looking at on the right here, which is the Garfield, the existing entry to MOCAD, with some of these other infrastructures, really celebrating and using the materiality of what cities could be like if we think of it through the lens of water instead, towards celebrating both the public health outcomes that come from this directly in terms of what it feels like to be in public urban spaces, and more indirectly in terms of how these kinds of efforts could add up in the spirit of Jane that we just heard. Lots of small projects like this really will matter and add up to a difference in terms of the water quality of the Detroit River. So hopefully just giving you some insight into the kinds of partnerships that would be possible by folks like myself, working with the work that I've seen and been inspired by hearing about yesterday and further on today. So thank you for your time, and I welcome questions.
Yes, these are very interesting concepts. A lot of these water repurposing projects are both land intensive and very expensive. How much buy-in are you getting from like local businesses, aside from maybe giving them tax credits, sort of as an incentive to locate there, and for both for employees and for customers? Thank you.
It's a very good question, and it depends a little bit on the circumstances of the clients that we're working with. So this is an example where there is a public mission that's aligned with this kind of work that makes the work easier. But the stormwater tax credits are significant enough that they are particularly effective with new construction, I would say, when you can kind of plan ahead and do this kind of work essentially for less money, because because you can pair it with a lot of the other infrastructure that you have to do when you're digging foundations and other things that come along with new construction. So it is a bit more expensive to do this as a retrofit than it is to do as new construction. But there are other incentives that we're seeing having to do with, again, scale. So multifamily housing is a place where you're seeing more of this kind of work happening because the impervious surface does add up to be quite a lot when you have larger bundled sites. And in some cases, there are incentives from a branding perspective for certain corporations and companies trying to align their own sustainability goals and missions with the broader work. So it's variable, and there are examples where this work is very difficult to do still, but those stormwater credits do make a difference. And I think there's more work that could be done from a policy perspective in helping to continue not just to kind of penalize not doing this work, but to actually incentivize getting the work done. And there are better examples of that in cities like Philadelphia has done a lot of work in this way. So there's other models available to look at to learn a bit more.
Hey, thank you for your talk. I was curious on the first project you mentioned when considering reestablishing the lower land in Brightmoor as a natural non-residential space. I'm curious what timeline or process flow that would require. More specifically, how could one protect the housing security for current residents while also balancing the possible immense benefits for the community of reestablishing the river in that natural space?
This is an important point because the time scale of projects like this in community would necessarily be quite different than the timeline of something like the Dick Winder Cut or more recently the Joe Louis Greenway, which has just opened in Detroit. When we're talking about greenways, we have the advantage of smaller partnerships and well-defined projects, let's say, in terms of scope. As you've recognized, there's a lot more sensitivity when we're talking about community work. And one of the reasons why we were drawn to Brightmoor is because at this time, it was one of the neighborhoods that had the strongest community organizations already trying to figure out how to advocate for support, essentially. And so if we, and this is something that is distinct in Detroit, even though it has been criticized, there's a lot of benefits that have also grown out of some recent planning work through Detroit Future Cities and some other platforms that really have grown the agency of neighborhoods and neighborhood communities in the city to advocate for and be the leaders of work that they would like to see done in the community. It's not perfect yet. There's still room to grow that. But if those partnerships and if those communities are at the table the whole way through and are part of a conversation around multiple ways to get here, because it could happen. It could happen in a number of different ways. There's no one way to do this kind of work. And there's no single amenity that could be introduced. So this could be, naturalized park systems. It could be layered with more formalized amenities like basketball courts or something, or be associated with a growing resilience hub network that is emerging in Detroit. So the exact outcome that comes out of this ideally would be something that is representative and different in each localized community. But the way to get there is to also make sure that the way that we're looking at those communities and imagining what's possible is taking more than just the vacancy or more than just historic imagination of what the city was into account in terms of what it might become.
No questions online. Thank you so much for this presentation. Coming from a public health background, we often have the problem of explaining something that didn't happen or that you can't see. And it sounds like as you're engaging with this, you're bringing it into people's consciousness, the issues, and then it sort of gets buried again. And I'm just curious how you're thinking about keeping it in front of people so that they can understand the improvement or why it is a certain way, if you're thinking at all about that. Thank you.
So this is also a great question, and I'll use an example that is not our work. This work, this pivoted honestly more to do with tenure track than with community engagement. There were some barriers in terms of dissemination platforms that were one of the major reasons why this work stopped in 2016 for Maria and I, and is now perhaps a project that could be picked up again. But I'll point to another example out of Philadelphia as a way to answer the question. And this was work that was done by a landscape architect by the name of Ann Spurn. It was a very visible project in the 1980s through 1990s, where they did something similar, but involving school children. So it was a little creek called Mill Creek. Very similar circumstances to Detroit, environmental injustice communities, had historic creeks that were buried. She was trying to get her students out of the classroom and into the world and seeing things. And so they ended up working with, I don't remember the age, but relatively young school children. I think they were around third or fourth grade. And they brought into the classroom historic maps of the community. And those maps showed Mill Creek. And they brought the children out into the neighborhoods and walked around and mapped it out with chalk. They sort of marked where it was in the world. And that activity alone ended up having the children so excited to, for the first time, see that the place that they were living in wasn't always like this, and therefore didn't need to continue to be like this, that they ended up becoming incredibly passionate, effective advocates with their parents about what they had learned and what they were imagining. And it quickly kind of grew into an example of public advocacy where there were some small changes made, and it ended up being celebrated nationally. Bill Clinton picked it up, and it was being talked about as this amazing model. But what I think it signifies at the local level is that if you do start to make, again, small improvements that improve your everyday life, it almost doesn't matter that you forget in between that it's also improving the Detroit River. Once in a while, you will remember that. But more importantly, on the day-to-day basis, you now have something valuable that's in your community and improving your quality of life. And the more of that we can do, especially in communities that don't have access to those kinds of spaces, the more cohesive of communities we build, which does lead to greater advocacy and greater opportunities for improvements elsewhere. So our work didn't lead to that. Brightmoor is doing that with or without designers. They're figuring out how to do some of these things, but I think the impacts could be much more meaningful if broader partnerships and more consistent support from top-down structures like U of M, like the city of Detroit, like others that are better resourced than the community groups are, we're able to find, again, like structural platforms that allows this work to continue over many years. And so I see it in many ways as kind of, as structural barriers in terms of how work is organized, how incentives are structured both in academic and cities, and how we might rethink those a little bit too to make this kind of work easier to do for everyone.
So I was thinking about, there's an epidemiologist who's done work in reclaiming communities that he's from Philadelphia, and I'm blocking out his name now, but anyway. But what he did was he set up, when he did a community qualitative research to see what was problem. So they identified that there were two real problems with the communities. One was vacant lots that were filled with trash, and that then when they're trash, then they're trash. And the other was vacant houses. And so he got funds, and this is, I'm going where this is payment. He got funds to fund the local community to clean up the spaces. So what they did was they they provided funds or community members who maybe were underemployed or not employed to clean up the spaces and build a simple fence around the vacant lots and do some planting. It's very simple. But that was 10 years out, those spaces are still protected. And it seems to be that because it's their garden now, it's their space. And then also because they actually remember working on it. The other thing with the houses he showed us is that, when a house looks run down, it becomes a magnet for hiding guns and drugs.
Mhm.
And what they did was they, and again, hired people to go in and get rid of the gun caches, and then they put a nicer front. They just made the front of the building not look so inviting. And those also seem to have tremendous city. But when I think about like the work that you and your partner did, I mean, it looks amazing to me, but also I think like who pays, and then how does the community feel that it's reflecting their image of it? And then how do we bring those things together?
So great question. The answer is a little bit different for the neighborhood work versus the DeQuinder cut work, because the question of who pays for it is different in those two contexts. So the images at the end that I showed for Lafayette Park and for Eastern Market and so on, those are opportunities where there is already money available, and it needs to just be rethought. So right now, Detroit, like, one of the legacies of responding to the fees and to the violations around the Clean Water Act has been to build more infrastructure. And for the most part, what that looks like are various holding and pumping facilities that temporarily hold sewage and then pump it back to the wastewater treatment plant. And there's quite a lot of money being put into that kind of infrastructural scale. And so if we think of this more like we sometimes think of public art or other kinds of amenities, where a small portion of the overall infrastructure fund could also be designated for what's now called green infrastructure, then those kinds of projects become much more available. And it's really more of a limitation about what do and don't engineers do versus necessarily financial crises. Your question is more challenging to answer at the community scale, because that's where the funding has not historically been available or accessible, including with this funding was small enough that there wasn't a way to do any kind of physical intervention. And in fact, most of the grants we were applying for at this time prevented that from happening. We were not allowed to do any prototype work. We eventually got a little bit of money from Graham to try to do this on a shared site with a community near a similar community, but with a partner called Focus Hope, which still operates in the city. But the partnership was complicated because they had a change in CEO at the time, who was still in the mindset that vacant property should be parking lots and did not want to do plantings or gardens or anything of that nature. So, the community was on board. The folks who had the power and decision making were not. So some of this is about money and some of this is about expectations. And this is where the ownership really matters. What vacant parcels are we looking at? Do we know who owns it? Are the owners even active in Detroit? Many of the parcels in Brightmoor at that time had problematic, and still this is a problematic legacies of ownership where the ownership isn't necessarily an active resident. And so there are limitations in terms of what can and can't be done, as simple as like building a fence or cleaning the site up. So yes, those kinds of small interventions are incredibly important. And on the flip side, Focus Hope has, at the time they had I don't know how to describe it, a sort of branch of their efforts, which they were calling Hope Village. And we did some separate work with them around greenways and safe pathways for kids to walk to school. That has now sort of emerged into a separate nonprofit that's working in the neighborhood, and they're doing exactly what you're describing: collective cleanups, facade repair. They've grown to the point now where they're doing small energy retrofits, and we have some other faculty at Tubman College that are involved in this because the barriers there have a lot to do with both knowledge, how to fix some of the things yourself, and teaching residents to do some home repairs so that it gets past barriers of the expense of contractors, as well as a lot of barriers having to do with pulling building permits and enabling some of this work to happen. So while it's not shown here, what is emerging with a group of faculty at Tubman and some others at U of M are partnerships, including Tony Reams and the Seas Sustainability Clinic, are partnerships that are looking to try to figure out how what you're describing can start to happen, both in terms of what we could bring to the partnership, but not always like what we bring physically. Sometimes it's the expertise that enables the communities to get things done, which they haven't been able to do for time limitations, for knowledge limitations, for other reasons. So I think that model is more visible and pretty exciting to start to see really take hold now, which wasn't the case when we were doing this work. So there has been some exciting progress that's been made.
I'll ask a question that I don't know the answer to at all.
Okay, good.
But for issues on the large regional scale, such as permitting according to hydrological boundaries rather than political boundaries, what are the current opportunities and ways forward?
This is an area where I may not have the expertise to answer your question either. But what I would say is, I think that goes hand in hand with changes in partnership and collaboration structures. So I believe, even though we are seeing a lot of pullback around policy and a lot of defunding of collaborative, publicly oriented work from the federal level, at the same time, we're seeing a lot of growth in community partnership, in what many would call participatory planning, and in interdisciplinarity, modeled by those of us here together in the room. And the more times we have different individuals talking together about the way they see the world and the way they're operating in the world, I think the more possible it becomes to enact something as radical as a policy change that would regulate water from a geological or topographical perspective rather than a political boundary perspective, because it essentially reflects that we're moving to partnerships that recognize that folks working on water cycles may need to have an equal voice in the way that these regulations are established, as engineers historically have, or as politicians or others, sort of demarcating the more municipal structure of thinking. So I have a great amount of optimism for the kinds of fellowships that we saw earlier about health and the environment, the kinds of conferences that we're participating in now. This is the first time I've been invited to a conference like this, so I take that as a great sign, not just about me, but in general, people are searching for that to happen. They are facilitating these kinds of conversations to happen more. And I think that's where these kinds of changes originate from. Thank you, everyone.
Hi everyone, my name is Alex Song. I'm a PhD student in environmental engineering. I work with Professor Lud Raskin and Steve Sperlos. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Kevin Rose, who leads the Aquatics Research Lab on Rensselaer Polytech Institute. Dr. Rose has a unique interdisciplinary background. He holds a Bachelor in Material Science and Engineering and International Relations from Lehigh University, and received his PhD in Ecology, Evolution, and Environmental Biology from Miami University, studying the causes and consequences of variation in ultraviolet radiation in aquatic ecosystems. Dr. Rose's work spans ecology and biochemistry with a focus on understanding broad-scale patterns in freshwater ecosystems. His lab uses interdisciplinary approaches combining biology, advanced environmental sensors, and computational modeling to forecast how lakes and ponds are responding to climate change and land pressure uses. His research has been published in leading journals, including Science and Nature, and featured in media such as NPR and Washington Post. Please join me in welcoming Professor Kevin Rose.
Great. Thank you, Alex, for that very nice introduction. Thank you all for coming today. I want to thank Anna for a lot of the logistics of organizing this. It was a very smooth yesterday and today. And Betsy, thank you for the introduction. It's been an amazing opportunity to get to know you, get to know the program here. And let's give Betsy, so this is over 20 years now, her 40th time doing this. It's an amazing accomplishment. Let's all give Betsy a round of applause. Yeah, so as Alex mentioned, my name is Kevin Rose. My research covers a lot of different aspects of large-scale changes in aquatic ecosystems. So characterizing the effects of environmental change for freshwater organisms and ecosystems represents a major challenge in biology. And my research, I've got several different active projects. This is just a smattering of different current projects going on. In my lab group, we focus on things like eutrophication and algal blooms. Can we predict harmful algal blooms before they occur? Understanding the effects of large-scale regional to global environmental changes, including climate change. How is environmental change altering freshwater quality globally? Applying science and sensors and technology to improve ecosystem management and looking at biological tipping points. A lot of these projects are really geared toward trying to understand large-scale patterns in freshwater ecosystems for a policy bent or sort of policy implication. So one of my interests is in trying to translate what we learn scientifically for policymakers at large scale. So with that, I'm involved at a statewide level. New York conducts a statewide climate impacts assessment every 4 years, similar to the National Climate Assessment. So I've been involved in a New York State effort, contributed to the National Climate Assessment as well. And on an international level, I'm a panelist on the UNEP EEAP, which is the Environmental Effects Assessment Panel. Some of my attempts to try to get some of the science that we do into policymakers' toolboxes. What I'm going to talk to you today about is really focused on dissolved oxygen dynamics and responses to climate change. So that covers the middle box here, and also a little bit about harmful algal blooms, assuming we have time at the end. So that really, I'm going to go through an introduction and introduce climate change impacts of freshwater ecosystems, get into dissolved oxygen, why we care so much and how it's changing, and then touch on briefly some aspects of harmful algal blooms. So first, broad picture, climate change is altering aquatic ecosystems in many different ways, impacting the services they provide to society. My research focuses on freshwater lakes predominantly. Freshwater lakes, there's over 1 million freshwater lakes globally, holding close to 90% of Earth's liquid surface freshwater. These ecosystems provide surface water for drinking, bathing, power generation, transportation, support a disproportionate concentration of Earth's biodiversity, and recreational aesthetic opportunities. So there's lots of reasons why we depend on these ecosystems and why we value these ecosystems. At the same time, these ecosystems are challenged by many threats. Some of them operate at a local scale, some are operating at global scale, and there are definitely cross-scale interactions where we have global environmental changes interacting with local scale processes. E.S. Woolway has a nice review paper in 2020 where he reviews some of the direct impacts of climate change on freshwater ecosystems and lakes in particular. I will summarize some of these today, but some of the big things that we see, some of the predicted and observed already responses to large-scale climate changes that we see include ice cover losses, increases in temperature, but not always increases in temperature, and that's some of the interesting feedbacks that we see. Changes in stratification and mixing, and I'll get into what I mean by that as we go along. That's sort of the overview of the direct impacts of climate change on freshwater ecosystems, and that's even just temperature, right? If we start to include components of changes in precipitation and wind speed, we see a mosaic of impacts and ecosystem responses around the world. There's also a wide array of chemical and biological responses. And, you know, if we talk, whatever we probably talk about, there probably is a climate change response or a way in which climate change is altering freshwater ecosystems. Today, I'm going to talk about just two big ways, which is dissolved oxygen, changes in dissolved oxygen availability, and changes in productivity in algal blooms. So first, to get into a little bit of data here, a couple papers that have come out over the last 25 years or so, a real seminal paper by Jen Maigret, who at the time was at University of Wisconsin, published this paper in Science in the year 2000, showing trends in ice cover for this data set is now fully publicly available, but he compiled data on about 800 water bodies around the world looking at long-term trends in ice cover. And what you're seeing here is, you know, ice cover dates, the date of ice cover, breakup and formation. So top is freeze dates and the bottom is breakup dates. And you can see that those two lines at the top and bottom for same water bodies are approaching one another. And so you can see, for example, for Grand Traverse Bay right there, you know, historically, we had over a month of ice cover, and by the time this study was conducted or published in year 2000, that was barely freezing, right? And we see this trend globally. What's really interesting too, follow up by Sapna Sharma at York University, published this paper just a couple years ago, looking at really long-term records. So there are a few ice cover records on, in this case, Lake Suwa in Japan, where a temple there was collecting ice cover records since before 1500. And there's a river in Finland where this merchant operation where they were tracking when they could cross this river, right? When was the last date of the year due to freeze updates? And what we see there is some really long-term records with a sharp change over the last roughly 100, 150 years. So we've seen very clear evidence in ice cover records of some of the effects of climate change and really an amplification over the last few decades. Even new research building on these papers over the last few years have even shown an amplification or an increases in the rate of ice cover loss. A couple of papers on looking at surface water temperature trends now. This is one of the first global papers that came out by Catherine O'Reilly in Geophysical Research Letters, looking at surface water temperature trends over the modern satellite era record from in this case, 1985 to 2009, showing warming rates of about 0.3 to 0.4 degrees per decade. They also show a wide range of heterogeneity in warming rates across water bodies that they get into, you know, some of the factors that are driving that. So we have differences like shallow waters versus deep waters, or large water bodies versus deep water bodies tend to be responding to atmospheric forcing differently. but overall 0.3 to 0.4 degrees per decade of warming. And even I'll show you our record, I'll show you our data in a couple minutes here, which actually shows that these warming rates have continued at about the same rate as this earlier paper has shown. So my research group about 10 years ago now started to think about, okay, we're seeing warming rates, we're seeing ice cover losses. What are the effects of some of these structural features of aquatic ecosystems? Really, we were concerned and thinking about dissolved oxygen concentrations first and foremost. Why dissolved oxygen? Well, first, the solubility of oxygen in water alone is quite low relative to a lot of other gases. And when we lose oxygen availability, we start to move down the redox ladder, right? And so we get predictable changes in our biochemistry, our biogeochemistry, and the products of our chemical reactions that occur, with the end stage being methanogenesis. So when we're thinking about climate change impacts, with the potential loss of oxygen availability, we're going to be changing, potential for denitrification, methanogenesis, sulfur reduction, et cetera, et cetera. From a biodiversity perspective, too, we're really concerned about how the loss of oxygen might impact species, especially some of these more sensitive species. So there's a picture of some trout that I'm sure you've got a lot in Michigan. We certainly have them in New York State. And some species of trout will be sensitive to dissolved oxygen at concentrations of even 5 milligrams per liter. So most species, we really start to get sensitive species, or a lot of sensitive species, around 2 to 3 milligrams per liter. And we have some hypoxia tolerant species that can tolerate concentrations below that. But we certainly are impacting cold water fisheries quite early on with our oxygen losses. And I used to say here, when we're thinking about fisheries, I used to say all complex life depends on dissolved oxygen. And I had some microbial ecologists yell at me. They were like, microbes are really complex too. And so then I said, well, all multicellular life depends on dissolved oxygen. And then I had an oceanographer come up to me, Lisa Levin from Scripps, said, that's not even true. And she showed me this article that shows that there are these metazoans in the deep ocean that actually can survive on essentially zero oxygen. So now I say most multicellular life depends on dissolved oxygen. But regardless, it is tremendously important for supporting Earth's biodiversity. So most complex life requires oxygen. And our central question is climate warming driving global oxygen loss? We started this paper or this research project in 2016, so that shows you how long it took to start to compile these data sets and whatnot. And excuse me, within a year, a paper came out by Schmidt-Co et al. In Nature, not on freshwaters like we were studying, thankfully, but on the oceans, showing oxygen losses in the oceans. And they showed about a 2% decline since 1960 in dissolved oxygen concentrations around the world. 2%, I'll be honest, is not a big change, but it is important in areas where oxygen concentrations were limiting and where we were already at approaching hypoxic conditions. So we asked, are lakes miniature oceans, right? Do we see the same trends in oxygen availability? If we look at just solubility, as we increase in temperature, we decrease in oxygen content in freshwaters and in ocean waters the same way. So we should predict the exact same effect occurring in freshwaters. Are lakes just small oceans though? Probably not, right? There's other factors going on here. We've got much larger gradients in productivity, right? The open oceans are veritable deserts, and so a lot of oxygen in the oceans is just driven by solubility alone. We've also got massive changes in ice cover and stratification that can affect the mixing dynamics of these systems, so how oxygen from the atmosphere enters our freshwaters. And on that note of productivity in the lakes versus the oceans, as I mentioned, the oceans are veritable deserts. There's some work by Gabriel Yvonne Drascher published a few years ago looking at metabolic rates versus temperature. So this is 1/kT. So higher temperatures are actually to the left on this graph, but we see rapid increases in metabolic rates as we as we increase in temperature. All enzymatic processes are temperature dependent, and oxygen consumption rates, the biological consumption of oxygen, increases with increasing temperature. So given that our freshwater systems have more productivity, we should expect to see more biological demand for oxygen, so potentially a biological feedback loop consuming more oxygen as we increase in temperature. So with this sort of framework and these hypotheses, we started to compile this large global scale data set. We were able to compile data from 440 water bodies, 440 lakes around the world with a mean duration of 24 years of data and a total of close to 24,000 profiles of dissolved oxygen and temperature. The data set goes back to as early as 1940. The first lake in our data set was Lake Erkin in Sweden. We had limnologists going out and sampling Lake Erkin in the middle of World War II, which is quite impressive. But most of the records began at about 1980 and really picked up in 1990. And so that's where our analyses really started, and we focused on the period 1980 to present. And we separated our profiles and looked at surface waters versus deep waters differently. So we separated out the top 2 meters of our water column and the bottom 2 meters. And we really focused just on the summer period when we had the most data available and when we in fact expected oxygen stresses to be the most severe. Most of our data, as you can see, came from the US and Western Europe. Despite our attempts to pull in data from other places around the world, there just wasn't that much data at the time available, especially depth resolved data. A lot of places had just surface data, but we wanted to make sure we got data from through the water column. And we use this data to ask several different questions. How is dissolved oxygen changing in lakes globally? Do trends vary with depth? And can observed trends be explained by climate warming induced or warming induced solubility losses alone? So let's jump into some of the data. So across our water bodies here, this plot on the right-hand side, we see surface temperatures over time, 1980 to 2020 or 2019, I think data went through. And we see surface temperatures increasing. And meanwhile, dissolved oxygen oscillates over time, but dissolved oxygen declines. This upper plot shows you the expected change in dissolved oxygen due to solubility and the observed change in dissolved oxygen. So our expected change is we can predict exactly based on Henry's law, exactly how much dissolved oxygen we should lose for every degree centigrade increase in temperature. And then we look at, does that actually map onto what we see? And the black is the one-to-one line. So if lakes are losing oxygen expected just due to solubility alone, lakes should fall right on that black line. The blue line is the lowest smoother, and all the lakes are color-coded by the mean summer surface temperature. And what we see is there is a lot of variability among lakes, but overall, that blue line falls pretty close to the one-to-one line. So changes in solubility really explain a lot of the changes in dissolved oxygen that we see in surface waters in our freshwater ecosystems. And our temperature trend was across all lakes was 0.39 degrees per decade. That's not that different from what Catherine O'Reilly found a decade earlier in her global synthesis of lakes, indicating that we're probably representative of global average surface water temperature trends. And this represented about a 5.5% loss in oxygen availability since 1980. So pretty rapid losses. Then we also looked at deep water temperature trends. Some interesting things going on here. Deep water temperature trends actually were oscillating over time across this global population of lakes. I can get into that if somebody asks a question at the end on why they were oscillating, but that's an interesting thing in its own right. Meanwhile, deep water dissolved oxygen was declining, and the rate was pretty similar between surface waters and deep waters, but that represented close to a 20% loss in dissolved oxygen in our deep waters since 1980. It's a much larger percentage, despite the fact that it's the same rate, because our concentrations in deep water started out as lower, right? Our median concentrations in deep water oxygen in 1980 were close to 4 milligrams per liter. So we're not starting from a place of high oxygen availability. So when you start at a lower concentration, even at the same rate of loss, it's a much larger percentage. And if we look at this change in dissolved oxygen due to solubility and the observed change, we see a lot of lakes clustered around 0, but that lowest smoother doesn't fit on that one-to-one line. And I'll get more into that in a minute. We were really interested in understanding that. What's driving those deep water dissolved oxygen losses, right? The surface waters are pretty simple. They look like they're explained by solubility. And we started our framework from thinking about deep water oxygen losses thinking about, okay, there's potentially several different mechanisms that could be driving these losses. First, just like surface waters, increasing temperatures could be contributing to losses in solubility. Obviously, that's not it, but I'm going to rule that out conclusively here in a minute. And then we also have other processes that could be changing. Increases in deep water DO consumption rates, right? I mentioned we could have this biological feedback where we've got more biological oxygen demand or potential changes in chemical oxygen demand that contributes to greater losses or greater consumption of oxygen. That could be one, or we could be changing our stratification, our changes in our seasonality of these water bodies. So, and these mechanisms aren't mutually exclusive either. Multiple things could be happening simultaneously. So first, a little bit of data on the first hypothesis there, that it's really related to changes in solubility. As I just showed, our surface temperatures were increasing, but our deep water temperatures were not increasing. They were just oscillating over time. And if we look at our distributions of our temperature trends through time, we can see the red is our temperature trends for all surface waters in all lakes. So this is a summer surface water temperature trends. And that's, again, the median there is 0.39 degrees. And our deep water temperature trends, that distribution is centered right on zero, right? There are some lakes that are warming, but a lot of lakes are cooling too. We published this work in 2001. Another paper published a global analysis of temperature trends the year prior in Nature Scientific Reports. And they found, just like we did, they found a temperature trend of pretty close to what we did. They found 0.37 degrees per decade. And they also found that deep waters were really not warming on a global basis. Right? So we have this increase in temperature, very similar between our study, Catherine O'Reilly and Rachel Pilla's study. But deep waters here, 0.06 degrees per decade, that's really slow, especially compared to our surface water temperatures. So really in deep waters, on the overall for the populations of these lakes, there is no substantial changes in temperature, and hence that solubility doesn't explain our oxygen losses over time. So our next thing with solubility changes ruled out, are we seeing this effect of this deep water oxygen loss driven by increases in deep water consumption rates, biological consumption rates? If we look at changes over the course, or just oxygen concentrations over the course of a season in, let's say, the bottom of Lake Michigan, it could be, right? Will look something like this. In the springtime, our oxygen concentrations are often high, often we might be looking at 10, 12 milligrams per liter as oxygen is mixing between the atmosphere and our surface waters. Then we get stratification set up, right? The warmer surface waters separate in density from our deeper waters, just like salad dressing with oil on water, right? And we get, then the deep waters are capped from exchange with the atmosphere. And once we've got that cap from exchange with the atmosphere, we've got biological demand, chemical oxygen demand, et cetera, drawing down our deep water oxygen concentrations, often very linear. And if we look at the bottom of any lake that stratifies, we often see concentrations that drop over the course of the season. And we were focused on this summer period in July and August. Now, and the period of this oxygen decline is bracketed by that stratification onset, when the stratification sets up and when it breaks down and fall. And if deep water consumption rates increase, effectively what we would see is seasonally that rate becomes steeper, right? We see oxygen getting drawn down at a faster rate. So for a subset of this 400 lake sample that we had different, decently seasonally resolved data. So we could start to look at this seasonality in it. So we started with about 400 lakes. For this analysis, we had about 175 lakes where we could look at, are these rates of oxygen consumption, the rates of oxygen loss increasing over time, the seasonal rate increasing? Alternatively, we could have changes in stratification phenology. I just mentioned we've got ice cover loss, right? So the lakes are warming more in the springtime. This onset of the stratification, when the deep waters get capped from exchange with the atmosphere, could be shifting earlier. And that earlier time period, if that's starting earlier, even if that biological consumption rate in our deep waters is the exact same rate that it was historically, when we look in the summer months, we're going to have lower oxygen concentrations just because we've started to lose oxygen earlier in the year. So we really wanted to separate out what's going on here. Are we seeing changes in our consumption rates or our onset of stratification here? And I also want to mention too, if it is driven by changes in stratification, we also know the stratification is getting later in the year too. We focused on the summer period, just July and August, but if stratification is also getting later in the year, probably our time of peak oxygen stress is also getting later in the year. And that's one of the implications of changes in stratification phenology. Okay, so what was it here? So first, we looked at these changes in our consumption rates. The distribution of this 190 lakes that we had, plus or minus, was centered right on 0. And that actually surprised me. I was expecting to see higher oxygen consumption rates over time. And what we see here is it's very up to what's going on in the individual watershed around these lakes, right? In some cases, we have things like pollution controls actually being effective. And that means that these rates are not actually slowing down, like shifting from the blue line to the red line. They're actually getting slower over time, right? We've got less biological oxygen demand over time in some water bodies. Meanwhile, we also have things like invasive species, right? We all probably most of this audience are aware of things like quagga mussels and zebra mussels that improve water clarity. They also improve dissolved oxygen in deep waters often. So we often think of invasive species as having negative impacts on our ecosystems, and they do. But in terms of dissolved oxygen, some invasive species actually can improve dissolved oxygen. We've got good data from Oneida Lake in central New York that shows when we got zebra mussels coming into those lakes, they improved water clarity. Photosynthesis started occurring deeper in the lake. So you got oxygen production deeper in the lake. And within a couple years of major zebra mussel outbreaks, dissolved oxygen started to increase over time in deep waters. So you've got some complex feedbacks that are operating at the local scale in each lake. Opposing these factors like pollution controls and invasive species, we've got things like eutrophication or increases in nutrients. A lot of water bodies in Western Europe, the Northeast US, and some in the upper Midwest here are also undergoing what's called browning. And this is increases in dissolved organic matter that's entering these water bodies. A lot of times they're responding to acid deposition. So the solubility of organic matter is pH dependent. And as we've solved our acid rain problem, we're getting more mobilization of organic matter to these water bodies. That organic matter is a substrate for respiration, which then consumes more oxygen. So we've got these complex feedbacks, and it's really lake specific going on. But overall, across the entire population of lakes, we find that changes in that deep water dissolved oxygen consumption rate doesn't explain our oxygen losses over time. Meanwhile, what definitely does is our stratification is changing across all of these lakes. Across this data set, we found that lakes are shifting earlier by about 1.4 days per decade in that onset of stratification. They're also shifting later by about 2.5 days per decade in stratification for an overall change in that duration of stratification of about 3.8 days per decade. Further reinforcing some of these results, we looked at this relationship between changes in water clarity as measured by Secchi depth and our change in the percent saturation, our dissolved oxygen saturation. We use changes in Secchi depth as a proxy for productivity of the system, right? How much algae they have, this labile carbon. And what we found is there is definitely a relationship between those factors. When we get an improvement in water clarity, we get an improvement in our dissolved oxygen concentrations. When we lose water clarity, we're losing dissolved oxygen. And that's not terribly surprising here. But what's interesting is we see this relationship, but overall, lakes were pretty balanced on whether or not clarity was improving or declining over time, right? There wasn't a massive shift of most water bodies are losing water clarity or most water bodies are improving in water clarity. Meanwhile, we also looked at the change in the density difference between our surface waters and deep waters. So I mentioned how this is a proxy for stratification, right? I mentioned how surface waters were increasing in temperature, but deep waters were not increasing in temperature. So that means, if you've got one layer increasing in temperature and the other one not, our density is temperature dependent. So we're getting density differences because the different layers are warming at different rates, right? And here, most lakes are getting a greater change in density difference. So they're stratifying more strongly, and that acts as a physical barrier to getting new oxygen mixing down deep in these lakes. And only a subset of these lakes are actually getting losses in that density difference between our surface waters and deep waters. So here we've ruled out in deep waters what best explains our dissolved oxygen losses. We've ruled out solubility changes. On a population level basis, it doesn't look like changes in our DO consumption rates are really changing, and it really looks like it's changes in stratification that are really driving our oxygen losses over time. One of the implications here is that if we think about forward decades to come, E.S. and Woolway also put out a paper in Nature Communications modeling different representative concentration pathway projections of future climate, using future climate scenarios. What is our duration of stratification and how is that going to change? So our anomaly is how we expect stratification to change in the future relative to today. And it's predicted under fast warming. So this is RCP 8.5, or now known as Shared Socioeconomic Pathway 8.0, I think. Additional radiative forcing by the end of the year, or sorry, by the end of the century, we're expected to see over a month longer of average stratification in our freshwater ecosystems. So the losses that we're seeing already in oxygen losses we attribute to changes in stratification. Stratification is expected to continue to increase in duration through the end of the century. So we are then, by inference, we're projecting continued losses of dissolved oxygen, at least so long as we've got increases in that stratification duration. Okay, to summarize this section a little bit. Warmer temperatures are caused by reduced DO solubility in surface waters. Consistent with ice cover loss and warming air temperatures, climate change is shifting the onset of stratification earlier, resulting in more time for deep water deoxygenation. Stratification is also shifting later, so the severity of DO losses is probably greater than what our study indicated, because we were focused on just July and August, and the peak period of oxygen stress is actually probably getting into September and October now for your average temperate water body. Excuse me. And finally, deoxygenation is projected to continue or perhaps amplify in coming decades. This all begs the question, if you're a water resources manager, policymaker, how do you locally manage DO concentrations when the dominant driver of deoxygenation is a global process? Now, I mentioned things like invasive species, nutrient reduction controls can be important. And what this says is things like especially nutrient reduction policies, reducing that organic matter load, become even more important. So even just maintaining status water quality, maintaining static or current dissolved oxygen concentrations is likely to take proactive management in future years to decades. All right. So thinking forward, when we published this paper, the main results, 2021, 2023, when a lot of these results came back, there was a lot of popular press coverage on this and a lot of scientific interest in it. And it reinforced to me of how important these issues were and how deoxygenation wasn't just a freshwater pattern. So I mentioned the Schmidt-Co paper et al. In 2017. Denise Breitberg had published this paper in 2018 in Science showing deoxygenation in hypoxic zones around the world. Another paper in 2023 showed deoxygenation occurring in rivers, which was not expected at the time because rivers are well mixed with the atmosphere, right? We get a lot of turbulence and oxygen mixing there. And so working with colleagues across the freshwater and marine communities, we put together a perspective paper published last year in Nature, Ecology, and Evolution, arguing that deoxygenation really boils, it's occurring across many different types of aquatic ecosystems and boils down to three different types of drivers, right? We got Henry's law, that changes in solubility I mentioned, stratification and mixing, I just went into a lot of detail on that, and of course changes in that organic matter loading and changes in gross parent production or respiration. that then regulate the balance between biological production and consumption of oxygen. And we also argued that dissolved oxygen represents a planetary boundary process. So Johann Rockstrom published a paper in 2009 arguing that there were 9 planetary boundary processes regulating the habitability and sustainability of the planet. And this plot on the left, this is from Stefan et al., which was a follow-up paper to Rockstrom's 2009 paper, showing how perturbed these different planetary boundary processes were, right? And they argued things, for example, like biogeochemical flows of nitrogen and phosphorus were majorly perturbed. On the other hand, things like stratospheric ozone depletion. Thankfully, we have the Montreal protocols that regulated CFC emissions, and so our ozone is still within a very safe operating space. What we proposed in our paper is that dissolved oxygen, because it regulates so many of these planetary boundary processes, deserves to be its own planetary boundary itself. That's under consideration right now, and ultimately there is no judge on this. It's just we propose this as something for the scientific community to think about for potential future iterations of planetary boundaries. I also personally just like having there was originally 9, and I like having 10, nice round number, more. Anyway, that's the current state of the research here, and we hope that the scientific community will take this up. And even if it doesn't become a planetary boundary process, folks at the Potsdam Institute put this out. We do think that we're at least having this conversation, right, about this importance and how how dissolved oxygen regulates so many other biogeochemical processes, biospheric integrity, et cetera. All right, so concluding some of this, dissolved oxygen concentrations are declining in lakes, 2.5 to 10 times the rates observed in the oceans. Surface water is primarily responding to increases in temperature. Dissolved oxygen are primarily responding to changes in stratification. And deoxygenation is critical feedbacks to other global scale processes and therefore arguably represents a planetary boundary process. That's really the summary of the dissolved oxygen nature of my work. I'm going to spend now probably just 2 or 3 more minutes and talk about the implications for productivity and algal blooms. Now, as I mentioned in the initial one of my early slides, we have these chemical and biological responses to dissolved oxygen or to climate change, and I mentioned dissolved oxygen. Now I just want to talk about productivity for a couple minutes. So one of the key questions, and when we're thinking about how our freshwaters and lakes in particular going to respond to climate warming, we don't know and have a good sense on how the productivity, so the algal biomass or harmful algal blooms, will respond to climate warming. Productivity and dissolved oxygen are coupled, right? And productivity controls carbon cycling, fisheries, water quality evaluations, et cetera. Harmful algal blooms in particular can respond to temperature and, an analysis that is over 10 years at this point put U.S. economic losses at over, close to over $4.5 billion annually from harmful algal blooms. So these are toxin-producing cyanobacteria blooms. There's two main hypotheses about how climate warming in particular will influence algal blooms. First hypothesis is that increases in temperature will favor cyanobacteria. A paper by Hans Perl, 2009, shows what we refer to thermal performance curves of different types of algae. And we have a green algae and a diatom showing these peaks in specific growth rates at cooler temperatures relative to the thermal performance curves of Planktothrix and microcystins that occur at much higher temperatures, about 24 to even 25 degrees C. So as we increase in temperature based on this, we should expect to see increases in productivity, and especially increases in cyanobacterial blooms. A competing hypothesis, though, it says climate warming will decrease algal blooms. And I am just focusing on climate warming here because when we start to wrap in precipitation changes and nutrient loading, it gets really complex really quick. So the hypothesis around climate warming decreasing algal blooms suggests that we might see an increase in stratification, which we know is occurring, right? And we know in a lot of these water bodies that stratify, as we get these temperature gradients top to bottom, so temperature higher at the surface than at the bottom, we also get the reverse profile in nutrient concentrations. So as we increase in stratification, we shift that stratification earlier, then surface waters potentially become more nutrient depleted, and then we reduce our amount of algal blooms or cyanobacterial blooms. This has been shown, for example, a paper by Cohen et al., published in Proceedings National Academies in Lake Tanganyika in Africa. They argue that this is occurring there. So we wanted to know, and the broader community, I think, wants to know, how is climate warming going to affect the productivity of our fresh waters? So first, there's a paper by Ho et al. Published in Nature showing remote sensing of, in general, an increase in algal blooms, or remote sensing evidence of increasing algal blooms. They show a peak, as they say, a peak summertime bloom intensity increased in about 2/3 of lakes, but they couldn't really attribute it that well to any common driver. It wasn't universally related to temperature, for example. So this paper is a little bit contentious, and there was some responses to that as well. If you're interested, please reach out to me. That's one argument. Okay, maybe we'll see an increase in productivity. Then, using in situ data, Grace Wilkinson published this paper in 2020 showing that no, we're not seeing an increase in productivity. So she looked at the magnitude, severity, and duration of algal blooms measured by chlorophyll A concentration. So if we look at the distribution over the trend in the magnitude of algal blooms, the severity of algal blooms, or the duration of algal blooms, all of them actually are getting less severe over time, right? And this is using actual in situ data from across the US. So what is it? Are we seeing evidence of increasing algal blooms or decreasing algal blooms? The evidence is mixed. Interestingly enough, going back to our dissolved oxygen story, our data actually can tell us something about what's going on here, at least indirectly. So I mentioned overall how we had this increase in surface temperature and a decrease in surface dissolved oxygen. And overall, if we look at our surface temperature trends, the vast majority of lakes, 80-something%, had increasing surface temperature trends. But of those ones that are increasing in surface water temperature, 87 of them were actually increasing in dissolved oxygen. That's opposite what we'd expect due to solubility theory, right? Now, these 224, they're consistent with solubility theory, but there are a lot of lakes here, close to a quarter of all lakes, where we're getting increases in temperature and increases in dissolved oxygen. And if we plot just those 87 lakes, they're no different than the other water bodies generally in our surface temperature trends, but our dissolved oxygen trends was really different, right? And so what's going on with those lakes? So if we look at the relationship between temperature, water clarity, and dissolved oxygen concentration as three-dimensional plot, what we see here is as temperature increases along this axis, in general, dissolved oxygen declines, right? So we see that solubility theory work out, except for when we get to very low water clarities. That's often indicative of more productive systems with more algal blooms. And then when we get to a concentration of a temperature, of about 24 degrees C, only at low water clarities, we start to see a spike in dissolved oxygen. We also see that if we look at the surface or summer chlorophyll concentration and our DO trend, when temperatures were cool, regardless of what our chlorophyll concentration is, our DO trend was negative. Compare that to when our temperatures are a little warmer or pretty warm. Let's look at just the red line here. As chlorophyll concentrations are higher at higher temperatures, our DO trend was more likely to be positive. All of this fits with this Pearl and Huisman study, which showed the thermal performance curve of cyanobacteria does well at warmer temperatures. And what we think with our dissolved oxygen data set, we didn't have phytoplankton taxonomy here, so we can't really actually say what's happening. But what this looks like pretty good evidence of is increases in algal blooms in nutrient-rich water bodies when temperatures are warmer. We're seeing increases in algal blooms that then are generating more oxygen and countering the solubility-induced losses. So we're seeing some evidence that we are seeing increases in algal blooms, but only in those more nutrient water bodies and those real warm water bodies. Anyway, with that, I want to quickly summarize. Our dissolved oxygen data provides indirect evidence that algal blooms are increasing in many lakes, increases in DO concentrations in some lake surface waters despite warming, right? Despite solubility-induced losses, and warming temperatures may facilitate more severe algal blooms. What are the proximate triggers for surface blooms to occur? Can we forecast blooms to occur? Can we predict toxin concentration? These are all really good questions, and I've already taken 47 minutes of your time. So I'll end there. And I just want to end with thanking, I'm here standing before you, but this was really a team effort. I really want to appreciate my collaborators, funding agencies, and the great team behind all of this work. So thank you.
Yes, a lot of interesting mixture of data here. You may have mentioned this, but curious, where in the lake did you sample? Like when you mentioned shallow, the surface, is that like near to the land or the upper layers of the middle of the lake?
Yeah.
The other thing is, did you take any, or any of these lakes have any, what is their salinity content?
Yeah, great questions. So we collected very little of this data. Actually, most of it was from government repositories, federal agencies, state agencies, et cetera. And most times, most of those programs sample at the deep hole, so the deepest spot in the lake. Sometimes that's close to the shoreline, but usually that's pretty far from the shoreline. Your other question, what was the second question? Oh, salinity, yes, great question. We ignored salinity. Yeah, we don't have, we weren't able to get salinity data, only on a subset of lakes. That being said, there have been some salinity changes, especially in these latitudes, where road salt is being applied. We're seeing an increase in salinity. Most times those salinity changes, like I can tell you in my lake in Lake George, where we have data, salinity's tripled since our surveys began in 1980, but it was very fresh. It was very low, and 3 times a very low number is still pretty low. So we did calculate for some lakes where we had good salinity data, how much of an effect that would explain. We ended up not including that in a paper because it only explained a very small percentage, and we didn't have that many lakes where we had salinity data for. So could it be important? It absolutely could be important in driving salinity changes, but we don't think it's a primary driver in most freshwater bodies. Yeah. Oh.
Hi, Evan. Thank you so much. It's such a great talk. I have a few questions, but I'll start with just one. So your studies, especially the first part, was focusing on stratification of lakes. So I was wondering if you also analyzed non-stratified lakes and whether you saw some patterns in terms of oxygen productivity over there.
Yes, we did. And that's where in those lakes, it's much more closely follows solubility losses. That's the main trend. Yeah. Yeah.
Is this on? Yes. Okay. I loved your talk. Rapid fire, lots of information, difficult to follow sometimes for somebody outside of your field, but I think I got most of it. But the final part, where you talk about the harmful algal blooms, I was confused because yes, I was surprised that the in situ measurement study found that there was no change in harmful algal blooms and versus the remote sensing study where they did find this. And so this is US based. What was the extent of the data set? And is 323 suggesting a lot of data versus the global data set? Was there anything because of the different locations that could be explaining these differences? And then, yeah, I would love to learn more about your predictions about whether harmful algal blooms are going to continue to be getting worse, not suggested by this data set, right?
Yeah, yeah.
I'm coming from a drinking water perspective. And so can we develop predictions for drinking water utilities where they're going to have these issues, when they're going to have these issues, because we need to change how we treat drinking water when there are harmful algal blooms.
Yeah. A great question. And I think I would argue the scientific community doesn't really know yet you have a good sense, like, are harmful algal blooms going to increase due to climate change or not? I even just talked about temperature, right? And then precipitation changes throws us all out the window. Jen, you talked about changes in loading, and we've got this issue of non-stationarity in climate where we're getting more severe storms in a lot of places, more loading, combined sewer water overflow issues. So potentially that's a bigger factor than temperature. We've started so the EPA has put out, they have a cyan remote sensing. It's like it's a data set, but it's more than just a data set. It's a whole collaborative effort to try to look at remote sensing of phycocyanin concentrations, which are the pigment that cyanobacteria produce, in more detail. That's an ongoing effort to really understand this. My team has started to look at using that cyan data set to look at where in the US are algal blooms becoming more common or less common. And one of my hypotheses, we haven't published anything on this now yet, so don't steal my idea, is that it looks like the algal blooms are occurring, harmful algal blooms are becoming more severe in the upper Midwest and Northeast. And one of the hypotheses around why these toxins are produced is it actually helps with nitrogen synthesis. And cyanobacteria are one of the few types of organisms, right, that can convert atmospheric oxygen to reactive forms. So with that, with the reduction, with the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments and our air getting cleaner, especially in the upper Midwest and Northeast, we're seeing lower nitrogen deposition. And one of our hypotheses right now is that our response, we're seeing more algal blooms and toxin-producing algal blooms because we think it might actually benefit the cyanobacteria because those toxins help with nitrogen synthesis. And we're seeing less nitrogen deposition now. It's totally a hypothesis that we're thinking about. But it just shows temperature. Yes, I do think temperature will favor cyanobacteria, but changes in nutrient loading will probably matter a lot more. Changes in nutrient availability through things like deposition could also be really important. So I think your local watershed factors probably matter more so than just a 1 to 2 degrees change in temperature, right? Oxygen availability will matter for nutrient loading from sediments, et cetera. How much agriculture there is in a watershed, riparian buffer zone protections, all of these things I think probably matter more than temperature. That's my feeling. Yeah.
Thank you for that. That was really interesting. Yeah. Something that struck me was when I was looking at some of your scatter plots with the dissolved oxygen, that it seemed like you had a few outlying points on kind of both ends that might have been driving some of your associations. And I was wondering if you've thought about stratifying your data further, like by geographic areas, or like maybe by lake depth and things like that to see if you see any more like emerging trends. And then the other thing that was kind of interesting to me was that when we look at the time frame, so kind of in those middle years, right, like 1990 to 2010, it looks like your error bars are pretty narrow. I assume that's what that is, right? Your confidence intervals. And then on each end of that, so then it's there's a lot of variability later in the time frame and a lot of variability earlier in the time frame. And I could understand maybe a lack of data and inconsistency in the 1980s and that. But I was kind of curious what's happening and more recently with the data. And then also kind of related to that is thinking about how has technology for measuring dissolved oxygen changed over time?
Yeah, good questions. So you do see some lakes here and there doing very different things. For our analyses, we try not to focus on them too much because then it becomes a case study paper quickly, and you do have some unique things going on, changes in aeration. We actually removed lakes if we found out there was any type of artificial aeration going on, because obviously that'll dramatically change oxygen. But things like invasive species, like I said, like the quagga mussels, zebra mussels, when we started to look into some of these, Oneida Lake was climbing rapidly in oxygen. And I was oh, it's a lot clearer now. And we've got now productivity down a lot deeper. We've got oxygen generation, photosynthesis occurring down deeper. And I think that was one of those lakes that I forget which one, where things were occurring differently there. So there are unique circumstances in different lakes, definitely, that are occurring. The uncertainty bands, yeah, I think early on and later on actually is due to sample sizes because of the data sets. Like not everybody has their data up to the present time. And so, we've got some up to the present time, but your sample periods, like I said, we had an average of 24 years of data, but the lakes that we have are coming into and out of the data set. And so I think early on and later on, it's a data issue. Early on, it's like, well, not everybody's collecting data yet. Later on, nobody, some people haven't made their data publicly available. For oxygen, technology has absolutely changed. We now have optical dissolved oxygen sensors. Well, for the last like 20 years or so, they're so much easier to use than the old Winkler titration methods. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So you've shown that there is no significance of oxygen consumption in your data. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I do think here, this is the distribution of changes or trends in DO consumption rate. And it was pretty balanced between positive or negative, meaning like, is this trend becoming steeper seasonally? That would be a negative. Or if it's getting shallower, that would be a positive. Sorry, it's the opposite. Pollution controls, it would be shallower over time. Eutrophication or browning becomes more severe like that red line over time. I think this is what's going on locally. I do think this is based around we are biased in our data set here, being predominantly European and North American, where there's a lot of pollution controls and a lot more better improved management over this time period. If we were to go global, we might not find the same result, and we might find things like especially in areas that don't have watershed, protections or buffer zone protections in place, or if there's more agriculture than there was historically, where populations are growing and local agriculture is increased, we're probably seeing an increase in consumption rates and a greater loss in oxygen availability. So I think this is just reflecting this was about 190 water bodies, that it just reflects the individual lakes and what's going on there.
Gotcha. Because another thing I thought, because you've shown that there is like more rapid decline in temperature and oxygen, like more intensified stratification, which is what I've been seeing as well. And so I've been wondering whether this density gradient might prevent sedimentation of a lot of organic matter to the hypolimnion and like settling in the bottom of the thermocline, which might cause like increase or more rapid decline in oxygen over there and more decomposition going on over there, which you wouldn't see closer to the bottom because it never gets there. And especially when the temperature is higher, so everything gets decomposed more rapidly as well.
It's a great point. We only looked at the surface in deep waters, but you could absolutely have that. And some water bodies, and you see this in the oceans too, there's metalimnetic oxygen minima that occur, and that data set could be analyzed, for that. Yeah.
Hi, great talk. I have a question about the data set. You use like massive data set, and it's a long-term and large-scale study. And I was wondering, you were using a lot of the government data set, and I know there must be a lot of research groups doing a year-long campaign. And like, how do people in the similar field share the data? Do you have like a shared database that deposit all the data they collected so that you can improve the representativeness and also reduce the heterogeneity of the data and make the data like more increase the statistical power and increase the representativeness or so?
Yeah, great question. So yes, a lot of it came from government databases, but a lot of it didn't. A lot of it came from academic groups. And there's an organization called GLEON, the Global Lake Ecological Observatory Network. So this is a grassroots group of freshwater ecologists from around the world. And we put out a call to GLEON and saying, hey, we're interested in leading this effort. If you have data, we are happy to collaborate with you. And this manuscript, it was led by my student, Steve Jane. I'm the last author, but we have 45 co-authors in between. And it's mostly these scientists that contributed data from around the world. So we try to take a collaborative model to this, and that's how we were able to obtain a lot more data than just beyond the government databases. If you've never heard of Gleon, I definitely encourage you to get involved if you're interested in this stuff, because they do a lot of large-scale collaborative research like this. And it's easy to join, it's free to join. And literally next week is a virtual meeting, so you could probably still attend if you wanted to.
I have a lot of questions. I'll just ask two of them. So first, could you define planetary boundaries? And then can you explain like the oscillation in the deep water temperatures?
Sure, yeah. So planetary boundaries are this idea, they're processes. They were argued using the language of like Rockstrom's paper, planetary boundaries that regulate the sustainability and habitability of the planet in a Holocene-like condition. Right? And they are major processes that if we perturb too much, we challenge the ability of our own species and other species to survive on a habitable planet. Right? I will argue, though, I think they were picked for pragmatic reasons, right? Like, is ocean acidification truly its own planetary boundary, or is it just responding to climate change, right? It's CO2 is driving that. But it is a separate planetary boundary, but I think it's picked for both scientific reasons, but then also pragmatic policy relevant reasons. So they are these processes that are policy relevant and are scientifically really important, and a lot of them interact with one another. Here's another one. One of them was novel entities. And then stratospheric ozone depletion is also one. That stratospheric ozone depletion is driven by novel entities, right? Ozone depleting substances are anthropogenic. But that's separate because of how important it was, sort of socially and politically. And so there are these major planetary boundary processes overall. Your question on the oscillations in deep water temperature. There are some water bodies, what we found especially in these large lakes in Central Europe, that they would warm up over the course of several years. So we'd see surface, or deep water temperatures warming up, and then they'd have a cold winter and they'd all cool down, right? And so there was synchrony across the European lakes, Central European lakes, because of that multi-year pattern where they wouldn't mix every year to the bottom. And so all of their lakes was sort of random noise, but when you superimpose a coherent pattern on a subset of lakes on random noise, you get a smaller, pattern that's driven by those lakes. And so that was what was occurring there. Yeah.
Any questions?
Picking up on the planetary boundary discussion, can you expand a little bit then on the policy implications of the dissolved oxygen loss? You spoke a lot about eutrophication. You hinted at some management trends, but it seems like there's some other things that are at risk here.
Yeah, and this is, there's a lot of work that's done at the UN level on oceans, especially, less on freshwater, but whether it's treaties or whether it's the International Year of Oceans or ocean trends in oxygen have made their way into the IPCC reports now. So bringing attention to it in this way, I think, is a great way to get this type of topic more attention in policy documents like that. And then hopefully then it gets attention, science policy, scientific documents like IPCC and other UN reports, especially on, there have been some in the oceans, and then hopefully making its way to treaties or national scale policy. So that's ultimately the goal here. It's a long-term goal. Yeah. And Rosina might actually, you might have more, perspective. Yeah. Thank you.